In the unforgiving desert of 1882 Arizona Territory, where the sun could kill a man as quickly as a bullet, kindness was often mistaken for weakness. Jack Morrison learned this lesson when he stopped to help a stranded Apache woman fix her broken wagon wheel. What seemed like a simple act of human decency would soon transform into a deadly game of survival, honor, and impossible choices. By sunrise the next morning, 30 Apache warriors on painted horses would surround his small cabin, their faces streaked with war paint, their weapons gleaming in the early light. But this wasn't a random attack or a case of mistaken identity. This was something far more complex, rooted in ancient traditions, personal honor, and a debt that could only be paid in blood or marriage. The woman he helped wasn't just any Apache. She was Ayanna, daughter of Chief Nailnish, and her rescue had set in motion a chain of events that would force Jack to choose between the life he knew and a destiny he never imagined. In a land where trust was scarce and survival demanded constant vigilance, one moment of compassion was about to rewrite the rules of two worlds forever. The desert heat shimmered like water across the rocky landscape as Jack Morrison guided his horse along the narrow trail that wound between towering red cliffs. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on his weathered hat, and sweat stained the back of his blue cotton shirt despite the dry air. He had been riding since dawn, checking the fence lines on the outer edges of the Crawford Ranch where he worked as a foreman, and his horse was beginning to show signs of fatigue. Jack was a man of 32 years, tall, and lean from years of hard work under the Arizona sun. His hands were callous from handling rope and reins, his face marked by laugh lines around his green eyes and worry lines across his forehead. He had come west from Missouri 5 years earlier, seeking adventure and a fresh start after the death of his wife in childbirth. The frontier had given him both purpose and solitude, two things he valued highly in those days. As he crested a small hill, Jack heard something unusual carried on the desert wind. It was a rhythmic tapping sound, metal striking metal, echoing off the canyon walls. He pulled his horse to a stop and listened carefully. The sound was deliberate, not random, suggesting someone was trying to repair something. In this remote corner of the territory, that could mean a fellow traveler in distress. Jack urged his horse forward, following the sound through a narrow gap between two massive boulders. On the other side, he found himself looking down into a small valley where a single covered wagon sat beside a cluster of desert willows. A woman knelt beside the wagon's front wheel, striking something with what appeared to be a heavy stone. Even from a distance, Jack could see that the wheel was damaged, tilted at an unnatural angle. The woman looked up at the sound of his approach, and Jack felt his breath catch in his throat. She was Apache. There was no mistaking that, with long black hair braided down her back, and wearing a traditional buckskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork. But what struck him most were her eyes, dark brown and fierce, showing no fear despite being alone in the wilderness. Jack had encountered Apache people before during his time in Arizona, mostly in the town markets where some came to trade. Relations between the Apache and white settlers were tense, particularly after recent conflicts with the army, but individual encounters were usually peaceful if approached with respect. Still, finding a lone Apache woman in the middle of nowhere was unusual enough to make him cautious. He dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible and away from his gun. "Ma'am," he called out, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Looks like you might be having some trouble there." The woman straightened, the stone still in her hand, and studied him for a long moment. When she spoke, her English was clear but accented. "Wheel is broken. Axle cracked." She gestured toward the damaged wheel, with obvious frustration. Jack approached carefully, noting how she watched his every movement. "Mind if I take a look? I've fixed a few wagons in my time." She hesitated, then stepped back slightly, allowing him to examine the damage. Jack knelt beside the wheel and whistled low under his breath. The wooden axle had a significant crack running along its length, and the wheel itself was badly warped. It was the kind of damage that usually happened when a wagon hit a large rock or dropped into a hidden hole at speed. "This happened recently?" Jack asked, running his fingers along the crack. "This morning," she replied. "We caught between rocks when I tried to cross the wash. Water was higher than expected." Jack looked around and spotted the wash she mentioned, a dry creek bed that showed signs of recent flooding. Flash floods were common in the desert during monsoon season, appearing and disappearing within hours. Getting caught in one could be deadly, and trying to cross one was dangerous even when the water seemed shallow. "You're lucky the whole wagon didn't flip," he said, standing and brushing dust from his knees. "But this axle's not going to hold much longer. You try to move the wagon like this, it'll snap completely." The woman's expression tightened with worry. "How far to nearest town?" "Tucson's about 2 days hard ride south," Jack said. "But there's nothing between here and there except desert and maybe some unfriendly folks you don't want to meet." She looked toward the sun, calculating the remaining daylight, then back at her broken wagon. Jack could see her mind working, trying to figure out her options. None of them were good. A broken wagon in the desert was often a death sentence, especially for someone traveling alone. "I might be able to fix this temporarily," Jack said after a moment. "Won't be pretty, and it won't last forever, but it might get you to town." The woman studied his face carefully. "Why would you help me?" The question caught Jack off guard. In his world, helping someone in distress was simply what decent people did. But he realized that from her perspective, trusting a white stranger might not seem like the wisest choice. "Because you need help, and I can provide it," he said simply. "Seems like reason enough to me." After a long moment, she nodded. "My name is Ayanna." "Jack Morrison," he replied, touching his hat again. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Miss Ayanna." Jack walked back to his horse and untied his saddlebags, pulling out a small collection of tools he always carried for fence repairs. The makeshift repair would require some creativity, but he had an idea that might work. He gathered several straight branches from the nearby willows and used his knife to strip them clean. As he worked, Ayanna watched from a respectful distance, occasionally offering assistance when he needed an extra pair of hands. She was clearly intelligent and capable, asking thoughtful questions about the repair process and understanding his explanations quickly. Jack found himself impressed by her knowledge of wagon mechanics and her practical approach to problem solving. "You travel this route often?" Jack asked as he lashed the wooden splints around the cracked axle with strips of leather cut from his saddle repair kit. "Sometimes," she replied carefully. "I bring herbs and medicines to trade in the towns. People pay well for Apache remedies." That made sense. Apache knowledge of desert plants and their healing properties was legendary, and many frontier doctors relied on traditional remedies when conventional medicine was unavailable. It was dangerous work, though, traveling alone through territory where Apache people were often viewed with suspicion or outright hostility. The repair took nearly 2 hours, with Jack carefully reinforcing the damaged axle and adjusting the wheel to distribute weight more evenly. It wasn't pretty work, but it was functional. When he finally stood back and wiped sweat from his forehead, the wagon looked stable enough to travel. "Test it slowly," he advised, helping Ayanna climb onto the driver's seat. "Keep to level ground when possible, and Stop if you hear any unusual creaking. She gathered the reins and encouraged the two horses pulling the wagon to move forward slowly. The repaired wheel turned smoothly, and the makeshift splints held firm. After driving in a small circle around the clearing, she returned to where Jack stood watching. "It feels solid," she said, relief evident in her voice. "Thank you, Jack Morrison. You have done me a great kindness." Jack tipped his hat and walked over to his horse. "Just glad I could help. You be careful on that trail to Tucson. There's been talk of bandits working that area lately." As he mounted his horse, Ayanna called out to him, "Where do you live, Jack Morrison?" He pointed north toward a gap in the red cliffs. "Got a cabin about 5 miles that way, up in the foothills." "Why do you ask?" "A debt should be repaid," she said simply. "Apache people do not forget kindness." With that, she turned her wagon south toward the main trail and began the long journey to Tucson. Jack watched until she disappeared around a bend in the canyon, then headed home as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. The ride back to his cabin gave Jack time to think about the encounter. There had been something different about Ayanna, something that set her apart from other Apache people he had met. She carried herself with a quiet authority that suggested she was accustomed to respect and deference. Her clothing, while practical, was finely made with intricate beadwork that indicated high status within her community. Even her horses were exceptional animals, well-bred and well cared for. Jack's cabin sat in a small meadow surrounded by pine trees, built near a spring that provided fresh water year-round. It was a simple structure, 2 rooms with a stone fireplace and a covered porch where he could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. He had built it himself during his first winter in Arizona, working with hand tools and determination to create a home that felt solid and permanent. After caring for his horse and securing his gear, Jack prepared a simple dinner of beans and salt pork, eating on the porch as darkness settled over the mountains. The desert night was alive with sounds. Coyotes calling in the distance, an owl hooting from the pine trees, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. It was a peaceful end to an interesting day. As he prepared for bed, Jack found his thoughts returning to Ayanna and her broken wagon. There had been something in her eyes when she mentioned repaying debts, something that suggested her words carried weight beyond simple gratitude. But he dismissed the thought as unnecessary worry. He had helped a fellow human being in distress. Nothing more complicated than that. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with frost covering the grass in the meadow. Jack rose early, as was his habit, and spent the morning repairing a section of fence damaged by elk during the night. The work was routine and familiar, requiring just enough concentration to keep his mind occupied without being overly challenging. By midday, the sun had burned off the frost and warmed the air to a comfortable temperature. Jack was working on replacing a broken fence post when he heard something that made him stop and listen carefully. It was the sound of many horses approaching, moving at a steady pace, but not hurrying. The rhythmic drumming of hooves on hard ground suggested a large group, maybe 20 or 30 riders. Jack straightened and looked toward the trail that led to his cabin. Through the trees, he could see dust rising in the distance, and the sound of horses was growing louder. Visitors were rare in this remote location, and a group this large usually meant either trouble or official business. Neither prospect was particularly appealing. He walked quickly back to his cabin and retrieved his rifle from above the fireplace, checking to ensure it was loaded. Then he stepped onto his porch and waited, watching the tree line for the first glimpse of his unexpected visitors. Whatever was coming his way, he intended to be ready for it. The sound of horses grew closer, and Jack could now hear voices speaking in a language he didn't understand. His heart began to beat faster as he realized the voices were speaking Apache. A large group of Apache warriors approaching his isolated cabin could mean any number of things, few of them good. As the first riders emerged from the trees, Jack felt his breath catch in his throat. These weren't just any Apache warriors. Their faces were painted with intricate designs in red, black, and white, and their weapons gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. War paint meant serious business, and serious business with Apache warriors usually ended badly for everyone involved. The riders formed a wide circle around his cabin, effectively surrounding him. Jack counted 32 men, all mounted on excellent horses and armed with a mixture of traditional weapons and modern firearms. They moved with the practiced precision of experienced fighters, positioning themselves to cover all possible escape routes. In the center of the group, a man who was clearly the leader urged his horse forward. He was older than the others, perhaps 50 years of age, with gray streaking his long black hair and scars marking his weathered face. His war paint was more elaborate than the others, and he carried himself with the unmistakable authority of a chief. Jack remained motionless on his porch, rifle held ready, but not aimed at anyone in particular. Making the wrong move now could result in a very short and unpleasant conversation. He waited for the chief to speak first, knowing that patience might be the only thing standing between him and a very bad day. The chief studied Jack for a long moment, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the cabin, the man, and the weapon in his hands. When he finally spoke, his English was heavily accented, but clear. "You are Jack Morrison." It wasn't a question, and Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Somehow, these Apache warriors knew exactly who he was and where to find him. That kind of specific knowledge suggested this visit was planned and purposeful, not a random encounter. "I am," Jack replied, keeping his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "What can I do for you?" The chief's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the atmosphere around the cabin. The other warriors seemed to tense slightly, hands moving closer to weapons, eyes growing more focused and alert. "Yesterday, you helped my daughter repair her wagon," the chief said. "Today, we have come to discuss the debt that was created." Jack felt the world tilt slightly as understanding dawned. Ayana wasn't just any Apache woman. She was the daughter of a chief, which explained her bearing and the quality of her belongings. And according to her father, Jack's simple act of kindness had created some kind of obligation that required the attention of 30 armed warriors. "I was happy to help," Jack said carefully. No debt was created. It was simply the right thing to do. The chief's eyes narrowed slightly. "Among my people, when a man saves a woman from danger in the wilderness, a debt of life is created. Such debts must be properly repaid according to our traditions." Jack had heard stories about Apache customs and traditions, but most of what he knew came from rumors and secondhand accounts. He had never imagined that helping fix a wagon wheel could have serious cultural implications. But looking at the armed warriors surrounding his cabin, it was clear that Apache traditions were not taken lightly. "What kind of repayment are we talking about?" Jack asked, though he suspected he might not like the answer. The chief smiled, but it wasn't a particularly reassuring expression. "That depends on you, Jack Morrison. You have two choices. You may marry my daughter and become part of our people, or you may die with honor in combat against our finest warriors." Jack's mouth went dry as the full implications of his situation became clear. His simple act of kindness had somehow triggered an ancient custom that now threatened to completely upend his life. Marriage to an Apache chief's daughter or death in combat weren't exactly the options he had been hoping for when he woke up that morning. "Those are my only choices?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Those are your only choices," the chief confirmed. "But you do not have to decide immediately. Apache law allows you 3 days to consider your decision. We will camp nearby and await your answer." With that, the chief turned his horse and rode back toward the trees, followed by his warriors. Within minutes, Jack was alone again on his porch, staring at the empty meadow and trying to comprehend what had just happened to his quiet, predictable life. As the sound of horses faded into the distance, Jack sank into his wooden chair and set his rifle aside. In the space of 2 days, he had gone from being a simple ranch foreman to being faced with the most important decision of his life. Marry a woman he barely knew and join a culture he didn't understand, or face certain death against warriors who had been training for combat since childhood. Either choice would mean the end of Jack Morrison as he had known himself. The question was whether he was brave enough to choose transformation over destruction, and whether he could find the wisdom to make the right decision in just 3 days. Jack Morrison spent the first night after the Apache visit pacing the floor of his cabin like a caged mountain lion. Sleep seemed impossible with his mind racing through the impossible choice he faced. Marriage or death, transformation or destruction, life as he knew it or no life at all. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical thing, making every breath feel labored and difficult. As dawn broke over the eastern mountains, Jack made coffee with hands that trembled slightly and sat on his porch to watch the sunrise. The morning was beautiful, with golden light painting the red cliffs and a gentle breeze stirring the pine trees. Under normal circumstances, he would have found peace in such a scene. Today, it only reminded him that he might have just 2 more mornings to enjoy the view from his own porch. The sound of a single horse approaching broke through his troubled thoughts. Jack reached for his rifle, then relaxed as he recognized the rider. It was Tom Crawford, the owner of the ranch where Jack worked as foreman. Tom was a man in his 50s, gray-haired and stocky, with the kind of practical wisdom that came from 30 years of successful ranching in hostile territory. "Morning, Jack," Tom called as he dismounted near the porch. "Thought I'd ride out and check on you." Miguel said he saw a lot of dust heading this way yesterday afternoon. Miguel was one of the Mexican vaqueros who worked for Crawford, and his sharp eyes missed very little that happened on the range. If he had seen the dust from 30 Apache horses, he would certainly have mentioned it to his boss. "Morning, Tom," Jack replied, setting down his coffee cup. "Miguel's right. Had some visitors yesterday. Apache visitors." Tom's expression grew serious immediately. Apache visits to isolated cabins rarely ended well for the cabin's occupants. "Trouble?" Jack let out a long breath. "You could say that. Turns out when I helped that Apache woman fix her wagon the other day, I created some kind of traditional debt that needs to be settled." "What kind of debt?" Tom asked, settling into the chair beside Jack. Jack explained the situation, watching Tom's expression grow increasingly grim as the story unfolded. When he finished, Tom sat in silence for several minutes, staring out at the mountains and clearly thinking hard about the implications. "Chief Nailnish," Tom said finally, "that's who you're dealing with. I've heard of him. He's got a reputation as a fair man, but also as someone who takes Apache law very seriously. If he says you owe a life debt, then, according to his people's customs, you do." "You know him?" Jack asked, surprised. "Know of him," Tom corrected. "He's been trying to keep peace between his band and the white settlements, but it's not easy. There's a lot of pressure from the younger warriors to take a harder line, especially after what happened at Sand Creek and some of the other conflicts. A man like that doesn't make threats lightly. Jack absorbed this information, realizing that his situation was even more complicated than he had initially understood. If Chief Nailnish was a leader trying to maintain peace, then Jack's response to this situation could have implications far beyond his own life or death. "What do you think I should do?" Jack asked. Tom was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his words carefully. 20 years ago, I'd have said fight. Better to die free than live under someone else's rules. But I've learned some things about Apache culture since then, and I got to say it's not what most white folks think it is. "What do you mean?" "Apache people aren't savages, Jack. They've got a complex society with laws and traditions that go back centuries. Their family structures, their codes of honor, their spiritual beliefs, they're all sophisticated in ways most settlers never bother to understand. If you married into Chief Nailnish's family, you wouldn't be becoming a prisoner. You'd be becoming a member of a community." Jack had never heard Tom talk about Apache culture with such respect and understanding. Most ranchers in the territory viewed all Apache people as dangerous obstacles to be avoided or eliminated. "How do you know so much about their customs?" Jack asked. Tom smiled slightly, though there was sadness in his expression. "Because 15 years ago, I was captured by Apache raiders after they hit our wagon train. They held me for 8 months before I managed to escape. But during that time, I learned that everything I thought I knew about Apache people was wrong." This was a revelation. Jack had known Tom Crawford for 5 years and had never heard even a hint of this story. The fact that Tom had survived 8 months as an Apache captive and escaped to tell about it was remarkable enough, but the respect in his voice when he spoke of his captors was even more surprising. "They treated you well?" Jack asked. "Better than I expected," Tom admitted. "I was taken by a war party led by a chief named Cochise. Once they realized I wasn't going to try to escape immediately, they treated me like a member of the band. I learned their language, their customs, their way of life. It was different from anything I'd known, but it wasn't savage or primitive." Jack tried to imagine his practical, business-minded boss living as an Apache warrior, but the image wouldn't form clearly in his mind. Tom Crawford seemed too rooted in the world of cattle and commerce to adapt to life in the desert wilderness. "How did you escape?" Jack asked. "I didn't exactly escape," Tom said quietly. "After 8 months, Cochise told me I was free to go. Said I had proven my courage and learned their ways well enough to be trusted. He gave me a horse and supplies and pointed me toward the nearest settlement." "He just let you go?" "Apache law," Tom explained. "If a captive proves himself worthy of respect and doesn't try to escape for a full year, he can choose to leave or stay. Most choose to stay. I chose to leave because I had a wife waiting for me back in Texas, but it wasn't an easy decision." Jack absorbed this information, realizing that his understanding of Apache culture was based more on stories and assumptions than on actual facts. If Tom Crawford, one of the most level-headed men he knew, could speak positively about his time with Apache people, then perhaps the choice facing Jack wasn't as stark as it had initially seemed. "What was it like?" Jack asked. "Living with them, I mean." Tom leaned back in his chair and stared up at the sky. "Different. Everything was different. The way they think about property, about family, about the land itself. They don't see the desert as something to be conquered and fenced and sold. They see it as a living thing that they're part of. It changes how you think about everything else." "Did you ever regret leaving?" "Sometimes," Tom admitted, "especially after my wife died. Apache people understand grief differently than we do. They don't try to push through it or get over it quickly. They let it be what it is and help each other carry it. There's something to be said for that approach. Jack had never heard Tom speak so personally about his wife's death 3 years earlier. The man had simply returned to work the day after her funeral and never mentioned his loss again, at least not in Jack's presence. Learning that he sometimes regretted leaving the Apache way of handling such things added another layer to Jack's understanding of the choice he faced. The woman, Tom said suddenly. Ayanna. What was she like? Jack thought carefully before answering. Intelligent. Capable. Proud, but not in a bad way. She knew what she was doing with that wagon, understood the repair work I was doing, asked good questions. And she was beautiful, though that's probably not the most important thing to consider right now. Actually, it might be, Tom said. If you're thinking about marrying someone, attraction matters. So does respect, and it sounds like you found both. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. This time, Jack could tell it was only 2 or 3 riders, not the large war party from the previous day. He and Tom both stood and watched as 3 Apache warriors emerged from the trees and rode slowly toward the cabin. Jack recognized the leader as one of the men who had been present during Chief Nailnish's visit, a younger warrior with distinctive white streaks painted across his cheeks. The 3 men stopped about 20 yards from a porch, and the leader called out in accented English. Jack Morrison, I am Takoda, son of Chief Nailnish, brother to Ayanna. My father sends greetings and an invitation. Jack stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun belt, but not making any threatening movements. What kind of invitation? You're invited to visit our camp tonight, to eat with our family, and speak with my sister before you make your decision. My father believes that understanding comes before wisdom. This was unexpected. Jack had assumed he was supposed to spend the 3 days thinking in isolation, weighing his options without any additional input from the Apache side. The opportunity to actually talk with Ayanna before making his decision was both appealing and terrifying. Is this part of the traditional process? Jack asked. Takoda's expression suggested amusement, though he remained formal in his response. There is no traditional process for this situation. A white man saving a chief's daughter and creating a life debt is not something that has happened before. My father is making new tradition as we go. Tom stepped forward and addressed Takoda directly. I am Tom Crawford, Jack's employer and friend. May I ask about the safety of this visit? Takoda studied Tom for a moment, then nodded respectfully. You will be under the protection of our hospitality laws. No harm will come to you in our camp unless you bring weapons or show disrespect. Both of us. Tom asked, if Jack Morrison wishes to bring a friend for counsel, this is acceptable. But you must come without weapons and with open hearts. Jack looked at Tom, who nodded slightly. Having a friend and advisor present during such an important conversation could be invaluable, especially someone with Tom's knowledge of Apache customs. We'll come, Jack said. When and where? At sunset, follow the trail north into the canyon. We will be waiting to escort you the final distance. Bring no weapons and no deception. With that, Takoda and his companions turned their horses and rode back toward the trees, leaving Jack and Tom to contemplate this new development. Well, Tom said after a moment, that changes things. You'll get a chance to actually talk with the woman before you decide whether to marry her. That's more than most arranged marriages offer. Jack spent the rest of the day trying to prepare mentally for the evening's visit. He bathed in the cold spring water, shaved carefully, and put on his best shirt and pants. Tom helped him think through questions to ask and topics to discuss, though both men admitted they were largely guessing about what would be appropriate. As sunset approached, they saddled their horses and rode north toward the canyon Dakota had indicated. The trail was narrow and winding, following a creek bed that was dry except for occasional pools of water trapped in the rocks. The walls of the canyon rose higher on both sides as they progressed, creating a sense of entering a hidden world separate from the familiar landscape around Jack's cabin. After about a mile, they encountered two Apache guards who had been waiting for them. The guard were young men, probably in their early 20s, who examined Jack and Tom carefully before nodding and gesturing for them to continue forward. One of the guards fell in behind them, while the other melted back into the rocks with practiced stealth. The Apache camp was unlike anything Jack had expected. Instead of a temporary collection of teepees or crude shelters, he found a well-organized community of perhaps 60 people living in sturdy brush shelters arranged in careful patterns around central gathering areas. Children played games between the shelters while women worked on various tasks, and men tended to weapons and horses. The whole scene had an air of permanence and careful planning that contradicted Jack's assumptions about nomadic Apache life. Chief Nailnish emerged from one of the larger shelters and walked toward them with dignified steps. He was accompanied by Dakota and by Ayanna herself, who walked slightly behind her father in a manner that suggested respect for protocol rather than subservience. Seeing Ayanna again in the context of her own community gave Jack a different perspective on the woman he was being asked to marry. She was clearly comfortable and confident in this environment, moving with the easy grace of someone completely at home. Her dress was different from the one she had worn 2 days earlier, made of softer leather and decorated with intricate beadwork and patterns that probably had cultural significance Jack couldn't understand. "Welcome to our camp, Jack Morrison," Chief Nailnish said formally. "Welcome to you as well, Tom Crawford. We have heard that you once lived among Apache people and learned our ways." Tom nodded respectfully. "I was honored to be taught by Chief Cochise and his people. I hope I proved worthy of their patience." "Cochise spoke of you before his death," Chief Nailnish said, which surprised both Jack and Tom. "He said you understood honor and showed courage. These are good qualities in a friend." The chief gestured toward the central fire, where several older people were gathered. "Kulme, sit with us. Eat with us. Learn about us before you make your decision." The next several hours passed like something from a dream. Jack found himself sitting around a fire, eating roasted meat and corn cakes, listening to stories told in a mixture of English and Apache, and gradually beginning to understand the rhythm and customs of this unfamiliar community. The food was excellent, seasoned with herbs he couldn't identify, but that enhanced rather than disguised the natural flavors of the meat and vegetables. More importantly, he had a chance to talk with Ayanna away from the formal setting of their first meeting. She was intelligent and articulate, with a sophisticated understanding of both Apache and white cultures that came from serving as her father's unofficial ambassador to the outside world. Her trading expeditions to towns like Tucson weren't just commercial ventures, she explained, but fact-finding missions that helped her people understand and adapt to the changing political landscape of the territory. "What do you think about this situation?" Jack asked her directly when they had a moment of relative privacy. About the debt and the proposed solution? Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I think my father is trying to solve several problems at once," she said finally. "The debt is real according to our laws, but there are other considerations as well." "What kind of other considerations?" "Political ones. There is pressure from the younger warriors to take a harder stance against white encroachment on our lands. Some of them believe that peaceful coexistence is impossible and that we should fight while we still have the strength to do so." My father believes that building bridges between our peoples is the only path to long-term survival. Jack began to understand that his individual situation was part of a much larger and more complex set of issues. Chief Nailnish wasn't just enforcing traditional law. He was using Jack's predicament as an opportunity to demonstrate that cooperation between Apache and white people was possible. "And what do you believe?" Jack asked. "I believe my father is wise," Iona said carefully. "But I also believe that individuals should have choices about their own lives, even when those choices serve larger purposes." This was perhaps the most important thing she could have said. It told Jack that Iona understood the political dimensions of their situation, but wasn't willing to be sacrificed on the altar of politics without having a voice in the matter. "If I chose marriage," Jack said quietly, "what would that actually mean? How would it work?" Iona met his eyes directly. "It would mean joining our community completely, learning our language, our customs, our way of life, contributing your skills and knowledge to our collective survival, raising children who understand both worlds and can move between them as needed. And if I couldn't adapt, if I tried but failed to become what your people needed, then you would still be my husband, but probably not a very happy one," she said with a slight smile. "Apache marriage is not easy to dissolve, Jack Morrison. It requires commitment and persistence from both partners." The honesty of her answer was both reassuring and sobering. Iona wasn't painting marriage to her as an easy or romantic solution to his problems. She was describing it as a serious commitment that would require fundamental changes in how he lived and thought about his place in the world. As the evening progressed, Jack found himself drawn into conversations with various members of the community. The older men questioned him about his skills and knowledge, particularly his experience with horses and his understanding of the local terrain. The women asked about his family background and his reasons for coming to Arizona. Even the children seemed curious about this potential new member of their community. What struck Jack most forcefully was the sense of genuine community he observed. These people clearly cared about each other in ways that went far beyond simple cooperation. They shared resources freely, looked after each other's children as if they were their own, and made decisions collectively rather than following the orders of a single leader. It was a different way of organizing society than anything Jack had experienced, but it was obviously effective and deeply satisfying to those who participated in it. When the time came to leave, Chief Nailnish walked Jack and Tom to the edge of the camp. "You have seen something of our life," he said. "Tomorrow, if you wish, Iona will visit your cabin so that you can show her something of yours. Understanding must flow both ways if it is to be complete." The ride back to Jack's cabin was largely silent, with both men lost in their own thoughts about what they had experienced. It wasn't until they reached the cabin that Tom finally spoke. "That wasn't what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" Jack asked. "Something more primitive, I suppose. More foreign. But sitting around that fire tonight, listening to those stories, sharing that meal, it felt familiar somehow. Like a different version of something I already knew." Jack understood what Tom meant. Despite the language differences and unfamiliar customs, the basic human dynamics he had observed in the Apache camp weren't fundamentally different from those in any close-knit community. People looking out for each other, sharing resources, making collective decisions, raising children together. These were universal human behaviors that transcended cultural boundaries. The question that remained was whether Jack Morrison, former Missouri farm boy turned Arizona ranch foreman, could successfully make the transition from one world to another, and whether he was brave enough to try, knowing that failure would mean disappointing not only himself, but also a woman who deserved better and a community that was willing to accept him as one of their own. As he prepared for bed in his own cabin, surrounded by his own possessions and familiar routines, Jack realized that the choice he faced wasn't really between marriage and death. It was between staying safe in a known world that was ultimately limited and lonely, or taking the risk of transforming himself into something entirely new and unpredictable. Tomorrow, Ayana would visit his cabin and see his world as he had seen hers. And then, with just one day remaining, he would have to make the decision that would determine the entire direction of his remaining life. Jack Morrison woke before dawn on the second day. His mind immediately focused on the fact that Ayana would be visiting his cabin today. The prospect filled him with nervous energy that made sitting still impossible. He spent the early morning hours cleaning his already spotless cabin, arranging and rearranging his few possessions, and trying to see his simple home through the eyes of someone from an entirely different culture. The cabin was modest but well-built, with thick log walls that would keep out the winter cold, and a stone fireplace that drew properly without filling the room with smoke. His furniture was simple but functional, most of it made with his own hands during the long winter evenings. The single bookshelf held about 20 volumes, mostly practical works on animal husbandry, agriculture, and basic medicine, but also a few books of poetry and a well-worn copy of Shakespeare's plays that had belonged to his late wife. As the sun climbed higher, Jack found himself wondering what Ayana would make of his carefully ordered but fundamentally solitary existence. The cabin was designed for one person living alone, with no consideration for the kind of community life he had observed in the Apache camp. Everything about it spoke of self-sufficiency and independence rather than interconnection and shared responsibility. Around mid-morning, Jack heard a single horse approaching and stepped onto his porch to see Ayana riding toward the cabin. She was alone, which surprised him, though he supposed that after demonstrating his peaceful intentions the night before, Chief Nailnish felt comfortable allowing his daughter to visit without an escort. Ayana dismounted gracefully and tied her horse to the hitching post Jack had built near his porch. She was wearing a different dress today, one that seemed to blend Apache and white styles, with traditional beadwork decorating a garment cut more like the dresses worn by white women in town. It was a subtle indication that she moved comfortably between two worlds, adapting her appearance to match different social situations. "Good morning, Jack Morrison," she said with a slight smile. "I hope I'm not too early for this visit." "Not at all," Jack replied, suddenly self-conscious about his bachelor lifestyle. "Please come in. I'll make coffee if you like some." Ayana accepted the invitation and entered his cabin with obvious curiosity. Jack watched her take in the details of his living space, noting how her eyes lingered on certain objects while passing quickly over others. She seemed particularly interested in his bookshelf and the small collection of tools and implements that hung from pegs on the walls. "You live alone," she observed, settling into one of his two wooden chairs while he poured coffee from the pot that had been warming on the fire. "For the past 5 years, yes," Jack confirmed, handing her the cup and taking the seat across from her. "Since I came to Arizona." "Before Arizona, you lived with family?" Jack hesitated, realizing that he hadn't told her about his wife and the tragic circumstances that had brought him west. "I was married in Missouri. My wife died in childbirth, along with our son. I came west afterward, looking for a new start." Ayana's expression softened with sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss. Apache people believe that grief is a burden meant to be shared, not carried alone. 5 years is a long time to bear such weight without community support." Her response was so similar to what Tom had said about Apache approaches to grief that Jack felt a stab of recognition. Perhaps there was wisdom in communities that acknowledged loss as a shared human experience rather than a private struggle to be overcome through individual strength and determination. "Tell me about your life here," Ionis said, gesturing around the cabin. "What fills your days? What brings you satisfaction?" Jack found himself describing his work on the ranch, his relationship with the animals and the land, the quiet pleasures he found in building and fixing things with his own hands. As he talked, he realized how solitary his existence had become, how little human contact he had beyond his work relationships with Tom Crawford and the other ranch hands. "It sounds peaceful," Ayanna said when he finished, "but also lonely. Do you not miss having family, having people who depend on you and who you can depend on?" The directness of her question caught Jack off guard. He had become so accustomed to his solitary lifestyle that he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge how much he missed the intimate connections of family life. "I miss it sometimes," he admitted, "but I learned that loving someone means risking loss, and loss is a difficult teacher. It seemed easier to avoid the risk altogether." "Easier, perhaps," Ayanna agreed, "but not necessarily better. Apache people say that a life without risk is like a river without current, still and stagnant and ultimately lifeless." They talked through the morning, sharing stories about their different upbringings and the experiences that had shaped their worldviews. Jack learned that Ayanna had been educated by missionary teachers as a child, which explained her excellent English and her familiarity with white culture. But she had also been trained in traditional Apache women's skills and had chosen to embrace both sides of her education rather than rejecting one in favor of the other. "My father believes that our people's survival depends on our ability to adapt and learn from other cultures while maintaining our own identity," she explained. "I try to be an example of that principle." "Is that why you agreed to this marriage proposal?" Jack asked. As an example of cultural bridge building, Ayanna was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Partly," she said finally, "but not entirely. I could have married within our own people if political alliance was the only consideration. There are several young warriors who would gladly marry a chief's daughter to strengthen their position in the community." "Then why didn't you?" "Because I have seen what happens when people marry for political reasons without personal compatibility. My aunt was married to a war chief from another band to cement an alliance. The marriage accomplished its political purpose, but both partners were miserable for the rest of their lives. I do not wish to repeat that mistake." Jack was surprised by her honesty about the political dimensions of their situation, while also acknowledging her personal feelings. It suggested a level of self-awareness and independence that he found both attractive and slightly intimidating. "What would you need from a husband?" Jack asked. "If you were to choose marriage over remaining unmarried, what would be most important to you?" "Partnership," Ayanna replied without hesitation. "Someone who sees marriage as a collaboration rather than a conquest. Someone who respects both my Apache heritage and my individual judgment. Someone who can learn and adapt without losing his own essential nature." "That's a tall order," Jack said with a slight smile. "Yes, it is," she agreed, returning his smile. "But I have learned that it is better to have high standards and wait than to accept less and regret it later." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of multiple horses approaching the cabin. Jack tensed, remembering the previous day's visit from Chief Nailnish and his warriors, but Ayanna seemed unconcerned. "My brother Dakota," she explained. "He said he might visit today to see your horses and equipment. He is interested in learning about white ranching methods. Three Apache warriors emerge from the trees, led by Dakota and accompanied by two younger men Jack didn't recognize. They dismounted and approached the cabin with the same formal courtesy they had shown during previous encounters. "Jack Morrison," Dakota said in greeting. "My sister speaks highly of your horses and your skill with tools. Would you be willing to show us your methods of working with animals?" This was clearly another part of the informal evaluation process that had begun with the previous evening's dinner. Jack was being given opportunities to demonstrate his knowledge and skills, while the Apache visitors assessed his potential value as a member of their community. "I'd be happy to," Jack replied, "though I should warn you that my methods are probably different from yours." "Different is not necessarily worse," Dakota said diplomatically. "We are always interested in learning new approaches." Jack led the group to the small corral where he kept his horses, explaining his training methods and demonstrating how he worked with young animals to build trust and cooperation rather than dominance. The Apache visitors were clearly knowledgeable about horses themselves and asked informed questions about Jack's techniques. What followed was an informal but intensive exchange of information about animal husbandry, with Jack demonstrating white ranching methods while the Apache men shared their own approaches to horse training and cattle management. Despite the cultural differences, there was considerable common ground in their basic understanding of animal behavior and effective training techniques. "You work with patience," Dakota observed as Jack gentled a young horse that had been skittish around strangers. "This is good. Apache horses are trained with patience as well, though our methods are different." One of the younger warriors, who introduced himself as Nate, was particularly interested in Jack's metalworking tools and techniques. Jack showed him how to repair damaged horseshoes and demonstrated the process of shaping iron to create new tools from raw materials. "This knowledge would be valuable to our people," Nate said, examining a horseshoe that Jack had shaped and fitted. "We trade for metal goods in the towns, but being able to make and repair them ourselves would give us greater independence." Jack realized that this was exactly the kind of practical skill that could make him genuinely useful to the Apache community. His years of ranch work had taught him not just how to work with animals, but how to maintain and repair the equipment necessary for that work. In a community that relied heavily on horses and had limited access to manufactured goods, such skills would be highly valued. As the afternoon progressed, the conversation expanded beyond technical matters to include broader questions about life and values. Jack found himself discussing his views on land use, community responsibility, and the relationship between individual freedom and collective welfare. These were topics he had rarely considered in depth during his solitary years, but the questions forced him to articulate beliefs he hadn't realized he held. "White people fence the land and claim ownership of specific pieces," Dakota observed. "Apache people move across the land and claim responsibility for its care. Both approaches have advantages and disadvantages." "What do you see as the advantages of the Apache approach?" Jack asked. "Flexibility and sustainability," Dakota replied. "When we use the resources in one area, we move to another and allow the first to recover. When drought or other problems make one area unsuitable, we adapt by changing our location rather than trying to force the land to meet our needs." "And the disadvantages?" "Vulnerability to people who claim permanent ownership and refuse to share. As more white settlers arrive and fence more land, there are fewer places where Apache people can maintain their traditional lifestyle. Jack began to understand some of the deeper political and economic pressures that made his individual situation part of a much larger set of challenges facing Apache people. The traditional Apache way of life was being squeezed between expanding white settlement and government policies that sought to force all Native American peoples onto fixed reservations. Is that why Chief Nailnish is interested in building bridges with white people? Jack asked. To find ways for Apache people to survive in a changing world? Partly, Dakota confirmed, but also because he believes that both peoples have knowledge and skills that could benefit the other. White people understand manufacturing and agriculture in ways that could improve Apache life. Apache people understand the desert environment and sustainable resource use in ways that could improve white settlements. As evening approached, Dakota and his companions prepared to leave. Before mounting their horses, Dakota addressed Jack directly. Tomorrow is the third day, and you must make your choice. I will speak honestly with you, as a potential brother should. Marriage to my sister would not be easy for you. You would be expected to learn our language, our customs, our spiritual practices. You would be expected to contribute to our community's welfare and to accept guidance from our elders, even when you might prefer to make independent decisions. Jack appreciated the honesty, even though it made his choice seem more daunting rather than less. But Dakota continued, you would also gain a large family of people committed to your welfare and success. You would gain knowledge and skills that few white men possess. You would gain a wife who is intelligent, capable, and respected within our community. And you would gain the opportunity to help build something new, a way of living that combines the best aspects of both cultures. After the Apache visitors departed, Jack and Ayanna walked around his small property as the sun began to set behind the western mountains. She asked thoughtful questions about his work and seemed genuinely interested in understanding the details of ranch life and animal husbandry. Could you be happy living this way? Jack asked as they stopped beside the spring that provided his water supply. Away from your family and community, responsible for your own survival without much support from others. Ayanna considered the question seriously. For a short time, perhaps. There is something appealing about the simplicity and self-sufficiency of this life. But ultimately, I think I would miss the richness of community life, the sense of being part of something larger than myself. And could I be happy living the Apache way? Jack asked. Learning a new language, new customs, new ways of thinking about everything from property to spirituality? That depends on how much you value growth over comfort, Ayanna replied. Learning to live in a new culture is difficult and sometimes frustrating, but it is also exciting and enriching in ways that staying within familiar boundaries can never be. As they walked back toward the cabin, Jack found himself imagining what it would be like to leave this quiet, ordered existence and join the dynamic, complex community he had glimpsed in the Apache camp. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying, offering possibilities for growth and connection that his current life couldn't provide, while also requiring him to give up the safety and predictability he had come to value. What do you think I should do? He asked Ayanna as they reached the porch. I think you should do what feels most true to your deepest nature, she replied. But I also think you should remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. The most meaningful choices are rarely the easiest ones. Before mounting her horse to return to the Apache camp, Ayanna turned to Jack with a serious expression. Whatever you decide tomorrow, I want you to know that I respect your consideration of this choice. Many men in your position would have simply refused without taking the time to understand what they were refusing. Your willingness to learn about our ways and consider our perspective shows wisdom and courage. And if I choose marriage? Jack asked, how do you feel about that possibility? Iona smiled, and for the first time since he had met her, Jack saw something that looked like genuine affection in her expression. I think we could build something good together, Jack Morrison. Something that honors both of our backgrounds while creating something entirely new. But only if you choose it freely, because you want to, not because you feel trapped by circumstances. As Jack watched her ride away toward the Apache camp, he realized that his feelings about this impossible situation had evolved considerably over the past 3 days. What had begun as a desperate search for the least terrible option had become a genuine consideration of possibilities he had never imagined for his future. The question that remained was whether he had the courage to choose transformation over safety, community over independence, and love over loneliness. Tomorrow, he would have to provide his answer to Chief Nailnish and face the consequences of his decision. But tonight, as he sat on his porch watching stars appear in the darkening sky, Jack Morrison allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to wake up each morning as part of a large, caring community, married to an intelligent and capable woman, contributing his skills to something larger than his own survival. For the first time in 5 years, the prospect of fundamental change in his life felt more like opportunity than threat. The question was whether he would be brave enough to embrace that opportunity when a moment of decision finally arrived. Jack Morrison spent the third and final night pacing his cabin floor like a restless animal, his mind churning through every detail of the impossible choice he faced. Outside, a summer storm rolled through the mountains, bringing lightning that illuminated the canyon walls and thunder that echoed off the red cliffs like the drums of war. The storm seemed to mirror the turmoil in his own thoughts, nature itself reflecting the magnitude of the decision that awaited him at dawn. He had learned much about Apache culture and about Iona herself over the past 3 days, but intellectual understanding was different from the gut-level certainty needed to completely reshape one's life. Marriage to Iona would mean abandoning everything familiar about his existence and placing his faith in people whose ways of thinking and living were fundamentally different from his own. Yet as Jack sat by his fireplace, listening to rain drum against his windows, he found himself thinking not about what he would lose, but about what he might gain. The loneliness that had become his constant companion since arriving in Arizona had lifted somewhat during his interactions with the Apache community. For the first time in years, he had glimpsed the possibility of belonging somewhere, of being part of something larger than his own survival. When dawn finally broke gray and went over the eastern mountains, Jack made his decision. It wasn't based on careful calculation of advantages and disadvantages, but on something deeper and more instinctive. Sitting in his solitary cabin, surrounded by the possessions that represented 5 years of careful self-sufficiency, he realized that safety and comfort weren't worth much if they came at the cost of growth and connection. He spent the early morning hours preparing for what might be his last day as the man he had always been. He shaved carefully, dressed in his best clothes, and wrote a letter to Tom Crawford explaining his decision and asking Tom to look after his few valuable possessions. If things went badly, Tom would at least know what had happened and why. Around mid-morning, Tom himself appeared at the cabin door, having ridden out to check on Jack one final time before the decision deadline. His weathered face showed concern and curiosity in equal measure. "Well," Tom asked, settling into his usual chair on the porch. "Have you made up your mind?" "I have," Jack replied, pouring coffee for both of them. I'm going to accept the marriage proposal. Tom studied Jack's face carefully, looking for signs of doubt or desperation. You're sure about this? Once you make that commitment to Chief Nailnish, there won't be any backing out. Apache people take their words seriously. I'm sure, Jack said, surprised to find that he actually meant it. It's the right choice, Tom. Maybe not the safe choice, but the right one. What convinced you? Jack considered the question, trying to put his feelings into words. I've been existing rather than living for the past 5 years, going through the motions of life without really engaging with it. This situation, crazy as it is, offers me a chance to become something more than I've been. Tom nodded slowly. I understand that feeling. After my time with Apache people, coming back to regular ranch life felt small somehow, like I was using only part of myself instead of the whole person I could be. Do you think I can make it work? Jack asked. Honestly, I think you've got a better chance than most white men would have. You're practical, you learn quickly, and you don't seem to have the kind of rigid thinking that makes adaptation impossible. Plus, you genuinely like the woman, which is more than a lot of marriages start with. They talked through the morning, with Tom sharing more details about Apache customs and social structures that might help Jack navigate his new life. Tom's insights were invaluable, providing practical advice about everything from language learning to spiritual practices. As the sun reached its peak, they heard the sound of many horses approaching. Chief Nailnish and his warriors were arriving for Jack's answer, right on schedule. Tom clasped Jack's hand firmly before the Apache delegation came into view. Whatever happens, Tom said, you're making this choice with courage and good intentions. That counts for something, no matter how it turns out. Chief Nailnish rode into the clearing with the same formal dignity he had shown during his previous visits. Today, however, his delegation was larger and included several people Jack hadn't met before. Ayanna was present, riding beside her brother Dakota, and she met Jack's eyes briefly before looking away in what seemed like nervous anticipation. The chief dismounted and walked toward Jack's porch with measured steps. His expression was grave and formal, revealing nothing about his own feelings regarding the choice Jack was about to announce. Jack Morrison, Chief Nailnish said in his careful English. 3 days have passed. The time for decision has arrived. What is your answer to the debt that stands between us? Jack stood and stepped forward, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him like a physical thing. This was the point of no return, the moment when his old life would end and something entirely new would begin. Chief Nailnish, Jack replied, working to keep his voice steady and clear. I choose marriage to your daughter Ayanna. I accept the responsibility and the honor of joining your family and your people. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for minutes, though it was probably only seconds. Jack could hear his own heartbeat and the sound of horses shifting restlessly in the morning heat. Then, Chief Nailnish smiled, an expression of genuine warmth that transformed his stern features. This is good, the chief said. This choice shows wisdom and courage. My daughter has chosen well, and so have you. The next several hours passed in a whirlwind of activity as Jack prepared to leave his cabin and his old life behind. Under Apache custom, the marriage ceremony would take place that evening in the community where the bride's family lived. Jack would need to come with them immediately and undergo certain traditional preparations before the formal union could occur. Tom helped Jack pack his essential belongings, focusing on practical items like tools and clothing while leaving behind the furniture and household goods that would be meaningless in his new context. Jack also packed his few books, hoping that Ayanna might be interested in learning more about white literature and that the books might serve as bridges between their two worlds. The most difficult part was saying goodbye to his horse, a reliable mare named Sarah, who had been his constant companion during his years in Arizona. Apache custom required that he come to his new life without possessions that might tie him to his old identity, and that included his primary means of independent transportation. "Tom, I want you to have Sarah," Jack said, running his hand along the mare's neck one last time. "She's a good horse, and she deserves better than being left alone to fend for herself." Tom accepted the gift with obvious emotion, understanding the significance of the gesture. In frontier society, a man's horse was often his most valuable possession and his best guarantee of survival. As Jack mounted one of the Apache horses that would carry him to his new life, he took one last look around the cabin and property that had been his home for 5 years. The small meadow, the spring, the corral he had built with his own hands, all of it looked suddenly foreign and temporary, like something belonging to a different person in a different lifetime. The ride to the Apache camp took most of the afternoon, winding through canyons and across mesas that Jack had never explored despite years of living in the area. The Apache riders moved with the easy confidence of people completely at home in this landscape, following trails that were invisible to Jack's eyes, but obviously well known to them. As they traveled, Jack found himself riding near Ayanna, who seemed more relaxed now that his decision had been made. She pointed out landmarks and explained the history of different locations, beginning what Jack realized would be a lifelong process of education about his new world. "Are you nervous?" she asked during one of their brief conversations. "Terrified," Jack admitted, "but also excited. I feel like I'm about to discover who I really am underneath all the assumptions I've been making about myself." "That is exactly what is about to happen," Ayanna agreed. Apache marriage ceremonies are designed to help both partners shed their individual identities and create a new shared identity together. When they reached the Apache camp, Jack found it transformed for the wedding celebration. Additional families had arrived from other parts of the territory, swelling the community to nearly 100 people. Colorful decorations hung from the brush shelters, and the sense of cooking food filled the air. Drums and flutes provided a rhythmic background to the buzz of conversation and laughter. Jack was immediately separated from Ayanna and taken to a special shelter where he would undergo the traditional preparations for Apache marriage. This process, he learned, included ritual cleansing, instruction in basic Apache customs, and the adoption of certain symbolic elements that would mark his transition from outsider to community member. The preparation was overseen by several Apache elders who spoke limited English, but conveyed their intentions through demonstration and gesture. Jack was bathed in water infused with desert plants, dressed in traditional Apache clothing, and marked with symbolic designs painted on his face and hands. Each element of the preparation had cultural significance that was explained to him through a combination of broken English and careful pantomime. The most significant part of the preparation was the giving of a new name. In Apache culture, marriage marked a fundamental change in identity, and Jack would need an Apache name to reflect his new status within the community. After considerable discussion among the elders, they settled on Nelnish Begay, which roughly translated to one who learns from the chief. It was a name that honored his willingness to be taught, while acknowledging his position as son-in-law to Chief Nelnish. As the sun began to set, Jack was led to the central area of the camp where the marriage ceremony would take place. The entire community had gathered in a large circle around a special fire that had been lit for the occasion. Ayanna was already present, dressed in an elaborate traditional wedding dress decorated with hundreds of small shells and beads that caught and reflected the firelight. The ceremony itself was unlike anything Jack had ever experienced. It began with prayers and songs in Apache language, calling on spiritual forces to bless the union and ensure its success. Chief Nailnish spoke at length about the responsibilities of marriage and the expectations that the community had for both partners. Jack and Ayanna were required to exchange vows that went far beyond the simple promises typical of white weddings. They committed not only to love and support each other, but to learn from each other's cultures, to raise children who could thrive in both worlds, and to serve as bridges between Apache and white communities. The most moving part of the ceremony came when members of both families shared stories and advice about successful marriage. Jack was surprised to learn that several other Apache families included members who had originally come from white society, men and women who had chosen to join Apache communities through marriage or adoption. Their stories provided both inspiration and practical guidance for the challenges Jack would face. When the formal ceremony concluded, the celebration continued with feasting, dancing, and storytelling that lasted well into the night. Jack found himself overwhelmed by the warmth and acceptance shown by his new community. People who had been complete strangers that morning were treating him like a beloved family member, sharing food and drink and welcoming him into conversations with obvious sincerity. Late in the evening, as the celebration began to wind down, Jack and Ayanna were escorted to a special shelter that had been prepared for their first night as a married couple. The shelter was beautifully decorated and furnished with soft blankets and practical household items, gifts from various community members to help the new couple establish their shared life. Alone together for the first time as husband and wife, Jack and Ayanna sat facing each other in the flickering light of a small oil lamp. The magnitude of what they had just committed to seemed to settle around them like a physical presence. "How do you feel?" Ayanna asked softly. Jack considered the question carefully. "Different," he said finally, "like I'm still myself, but also like I'm becoming someone new." "Is that how you feel?" "Yes, exactly like that," she replied. Apache people believe that marriage creates a third person, neither husband nor wife alone, but something new that emerges from their union. "I think I can feel that third person beginning to exist." They talked quietly through the night, sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams for the future, their fears about the challenges they would face together. By dawn, Jack felt that they had begun the process of truly knowing each other, moving beyond the formal interactions of their courtship to the intimate understanding that marriage required. When the sun rose on Jack's first full day as an Apache husband, he woke to find himself in a world completely different from the one he had known the day before. The sounds, smells, and rhythms of community life surrounded him. Children's laughter mixed with the sounds of people beginning their daily work. The scent of cooking fires drifted through the camp, along with the earthy smell of horses and the desert plants that grew around the shelters. Ayanna was already awake, moving quietly around their shelter and preparing for the day ahead. She had changed from her elaborate wedding dress into practical work clothes, and her manner was businesslike rather than romantic. Jack realized that the honeymoon period of their marriage would be brief, if it existed at all. Apache life was too demanding and community-oriented to allow for extended private time between newlyweds. "What happens now?" Jack asked, pulling on the Apache clothing that would mark his new identity. "Now we begin learning to be married," Ayanna replied with a slight smile. "And you begin learning to be Apache. Both tasks will take considerable time and patience." As Jack stepped outside their shelter and into the busy life of the Apache camp, he felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension that was unlike anything he had experienced since arriving in Arizona 5 years earlier. The man who had helped a stranded woman fix her wagon wheel 3 days ago no longer existed. In his place stood Nailnish Begay, Apache husband and community member, facing a future full of challenges and possibilities he was only beginning to imagine. The transformation was complete, but Jack Morrison's real education was just beginning. 6 months after the wedding ceremony that transformed Jack Morrison into Nailnish Begay, he sat beside a campfire in the early morning darkness, watching his breath form clouds in the cold mountain air. Winter had come to the Apache homeland, and the community had moved to their traditional winter camp in a protected canyon where ancient cliff dwellings provided shelter from the harsh weather. The man who sat by that fire bore little resemblance to the solitary ranch foreman who had helped a stranded woman fix her wagon wheel the previous summer. Jack's hair had grown longer and was now braided in Apache style. His skin was darker from constant exposure to sun and wind. His hands, always callous from ranch work, now showed the different marks of Apache labor, learning to work with traditional materials and tools alongside the skills he had brought from his previous life. More significantly, his mind had been reshaped by 6 months of intensive cultural education. He was beginning to think in Apache language for simple daily tasks, though complex thoughts still required translation. He had learned to see the desert landscape through Apache eyes, understanding the subtle signs that indicated water sources, weather changes, and the movements of game animals. Most importantly, he had begun to understand the intricate web of relationships and obligations that governed Apache community life. The learning process had not been easy. During his first weeks as an Apache husband, Jack had made countless mistakes born of ignorance and cultural misunderstanding. He had inadvertently insulted elders by speaking out of turn during council meetings. He had violated hunting protocols by tracking game in areas considered sacred. He had confused the complex kinship relationships that determined how different community members should interact with each other. Each mistake had been corrected with patience and humor by his new family and community, but Jack had often felt like a clumsy child stumbling through a world designed for people far more sophisticated than himself. The depth and complexity of Apache culture had been both humbling and inspiring, forcing him to abandon many assumptions about what constituted civilization and intelligence. The most challenging aspect of his transformation had been learning to balance individual desires with community needs. Jack's entire previous life had been organized around personal independence and self-reliance. Apache society, by contrast, functioned through intricate networks of mutual obligation and shared responsibility. Decisions that Jack had always made for himself alone now required consultation with family members, clan leaders, and sometimes the entire community. This shift in thinking had been particularly difficult during the community's seasonal migration from their summer camps to winter quarters. Jack had wanted to argue for routes and schedules that made sense from his individual perspective, not understanding that the movement of 100 people with horses, equipment, and elderly or sick community members required considerations far beyond simple efficiency. Ayanna had been endlessly patient with his struggles, serving as both teacher and translator during his most difficult moments of cultural confusion. Her own experience moving between Apache and white worlds had given her unique insight into the challenges Jack faced, and she had developed effective methods for helping him understand concepts that had no direct equivalent in his previous experience. "You're trying to learn everything at once," she had told him during one particularly frustrating evening. Apache children spend their entire childhood learning these things gradually. You must be patient with yourself and understand that wisdom takes time to develop. Jack's relationship with Ayana had evolved considerably during their first months of marriage. The formal courtesy of their initial interactions had given way to genuine partnership and growing affection. They worked well together on practical tasks and had developed an easy rhythm of daily cooperation. More importantly, they had begun to create the shared identity that Apache marriage ceremonies were designed to foster. This shared identity was tested and strengthened during their first major crisis as a married couple. In late autumn, a group of young Apache warriors had proposed raiding white settlements in retaliation for recent army attacks on Apache camps in other parts of the territory. The proposed raids would have violated Chief Nailnish's carefully maintained peace agreements and potentially triggered devastating military retaliation against their community. Jack found himself in the awkward position of being asked to provide information about white settlement patterns and defensive capabilities. His knowledge of ranching operations and his familiarity with the territorial militia made him a valuable resource for planning raids. But providing such assistance would have meant betraying the trust of people like Tom Crawford, who had shown him friendship and respect. The situation became even more complicated when several of the young warriors suggested that Jack's loyalty to his new people was questionable because of his white origins. During one heated council meeting, a warrior named Geronimo's nephew had openly questioned whether a white man could ever truly understand Apache ways or be trusted with community safety. How do we know that this white man will not betray us to his own people when the time comes for difficult choices? The young warrior had demanded. How do we know that his marriage to our chief's daughter is not an elaborate deception designed to give white settlers information about our movements and plans? The accusation had stung Jack deeply, not only because it questioned his honor, but because it forced him to confront his own lingering uncertainties about his place in Apache society. Despite 6 months of intensive cultural education, he still sometimes felt like an outsider pretending to belong somewhere he didn't truly fit. Chief Nailnish had handled the situation with characteristic wisdom, neither dismissing the young warriors' concerns nor allowing them to undermine Jack's position in the community. Instead, he had proposed a test that would demonstrate Jack's commitment to Apache welfare while also addressing the practical questions raised by the proposed raids. Nailnish Begay will travel to the white settlements and gather information about their defensive preparations, the chief had announced. But he will do this not to help us plan attacks, but to help us understand how to better avoid conflicts that would bring destruction to our people. The mission had required Jack to visit Tom Crawford and other white contacts under the pretense of checking on his former life and property. In reality, he was gathering intelligence about military movements, settler attitudes toward Apache people, and political developments that might affect his new community's safety. The assignment had been emotionally difficult, forcing Jack to see his former world through completely different eyes. Tom Crawford's ranch, which had once seemed like the height of civilized comfort, now appeared crude and wasteful compared to the sophisticated resource management practiced by Apache people. The casual racism expressed by many white settlers toward Apache people was painful to hear, especially when Jack realized that he had probably held similar attitudes before his cultural transformation. Most challenging of all was maintaining his cover story while gathering the information his new people needed. Tom Crawford had been delighted to see Jack again and had peppered him with questions about his life among Apache people. Jack had been forced to provide carefully edited versions of the truth, emphasizing the positive aspects of his experience while avoiding details that might compromise his community's security. "You look good," Tom had observed during Jack's visit. "Different but good. Like you found something you were missing." Jack had realized that Tom's observation was accurate. Despite the challenges and occasional doubts, he felt more fully himself as Nailnish Begay than he had ever felt as Jack Morrison. The constant engagement with community life, the deep connection to the natural environment, and the sense of contributing to something larger than his own survival had awakened parts of his personality that had been dormant during his solitary years. The intelligence Jack gathered during his mission had confirmed Chief Nailnish's suspicions about the futility of raiding white settlements. Military preparations in the territory were extensive, with new fortifications being constructed and additional troops being deployed specifically to deal with Apache resistance. Any significant raids would have triggered massive retaliation that could have destroyed their community entirely. When Jack returned to the Apache camp with this information, his report had effectively ended the young warriors' push for military action. The detailed intelligence he provided about white defensive capabilities and military movements demonstrated both his effectiveness as a scout and his commitment to Apache welfare. Even the warriors who had questioned his loyalty were forced to acknowledge that his mission had probably saved many Apache lives. More importantly for Jack's personal development, the successful completion of his mission had marked his final acceptance as a full member of the Apache community. The elders who had initially been cautious about accepting a white man into their ranks now spoke of him with the same respect they showed to other capable adult males. The young warriors who had questioned his loyalty now sought his advice about dealing with white authorities. The winter months in the protected canyon had provided time for Jack to deepen his understanding of Apache spiritual practices and philosophical concepts that had no equivalents in white culture. He had participated in sweat lodge ceremonies designed to purify both body and spirit. He had learned traditional songs and dances that connected participants to the natural world and to their ancestors. Most significantly, he had begun to understand Apache concepts of time, identity, and relationship that were fundamentally different from European-derived ways of thinking. Apache people, Jack learned, did not view themselves as separate from the natural world, but as integral parts of a larger living system. This perspective influenced everything from their hunting and gathering practices to their social organization and spiritual beliefs. Learning to think in these terms had been difficult for someone raised in a culture that emphasized human dominance over nature. But the shift in perspective had been profoundly liberating. As winter gradually gave way to spring, Jack found himself looking forward to the seasonal migrations and activities that would mark his first full annual cycle as an Apache husband. He had learned enough about traditional practices to anticipate the community's movements and to understand his role in the complex preparations required for seasonal transitions. More personally, Ayana had begun showing the early signs of pregnancy, which would make Jack a father by the following winter. The prospect of raising a child who would grow up fully integrated into Apache culture while also having access to knowledge from the white world excited both parents and represented the ultimate success of their cultural bridge-building marriage. "Our child will know both worlds," Ayana had told him as they discussed names and plans for the baby's education. "But unlike us, they will not have to choose between them. They will be equally at home in both cultures from birth." Jack realized that their child would represent something entirely new in the borderlands between Apache and white societies. A person who could move seamlessly between both worlds, serving as a translator not just of languages, but of entire ways of understanding reality. It was exactly the kind of bridge building that Chief Nailnish had envisioned when he had offered Jack the choice between marriage and death. As spring arrived in the mountain canyon, bringing warmer weather and the return of migrating animals, Jack reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this point. A simple act of kindness in helping a stranded woman had led to the complete transformation of his identity and purpose in life. What had seemed like an impossible choice between civilization and savagery had revealed itself to be an opportunity to discover forms of civilization more sophisticated and satisfying than anything he had previously known. The man who had once lived alone in a cabin, carefully maintaining his independence and self-reliance, now thrived as part of a complex community where individual welfare was inseparable from collective success. The isolation and emotional numbness that had characterized his life after his first wife's death had been replaced by rich relationships and deep engagement with both human and natural communities. Standing beside the campfire on that spring morning, watching the canyon walls catch the first light of dawn, Jack Morrison knew that Nailnish Begay had found his true home. The transformation that had begun with a broken wagon wheel was complete, but the life it had made possible was just beginning. In the distance, he could hear Ayana beginning her morning preparations, and he smiled at the sound of her voice humming traditional songs that their child would learn from birth. Other community members were stirring in their shelters, beginning another day of the cooperative work that made their survival and prosperity possible. As Jack banked the fire and prepared to join the community's morning activities, he offered a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever forces had brought him to this place. He had thought he was simply helping a stranger in distress, but he had actually been taking the first step toward becoming the person he was always meant to be. The Apache who had surrounded his cabin with war paint and weapons 6 months earlier had offered him a choice that seemed like certain destruction of his old life. But destruction, Jack now understood, was sometimes necessary for genuine creation. The death of Jack Morrison had made possible the birth of Nailnish Begay, and that rebirth had opened possibilities for growth, connection, and meaning that his previous life could never have provided. As he walked toward his shelter, where Ayana was preparing breakfast, Jack reflected that the Apache warriors who had appeared at dawn that morning had not come to threaten his life, but to offer him a chance at truly living. It had taken courage to accept their offer, but it had been the best decision he had ever made. Behind him, the campfire continued to burn, its smoke rising straight up in the still morning air like a prayer of thanksgiving carried toward the endless Arizona sky.